Ash was still on her hands when the patrol found her kneeling at the base of the north watchtower, her fingers blackened to the second knuckle, her breathing the shallow, careful kind of breathing that people do when they are trying not to be heard. She had been drawing again. A guard, a stocky man named Halvard, who had been with the Ironmark garrison for 11 years and had developed, through sheer exposure, a kind of detached relationship with things that should have troubled him. Crouched down to look at what she had made, he held the torch close. It was a map, scratched into the stone with charcoal from the fire pit she was not supposed to have access to, detailed enough that he could identify the eastern corridor, the cellar entrance, the well shaft. And there, in careful strokes, she had drawn a line through the foundation of the south granary wall, with 3 small marks beside it that any garrison soldier would recognize as a structural fault warning. He looked at her. She looked back at him with dark eyes, set in a face that was too thin, the hollows beneath her cheekbones deep enough to cast shadows by torchlight. She was perhaps 23. It was difficult to tell. The kind of life she had lived had a way of making age irrelevant. She could not tell him what the marks meant. She could not speak. She had not spoken since the night she arrived at Ironmark, a half-frozen child of 6, delivered by a dissolving border pack with papers that said nothing useful and a name that was probably not her name. They called her Ash. It suited her in the way that names given by people who do not care about you tend to suit the version of you they have decided to see. It was grey and quiet and easily overlooked, and she left marks on surfaces that people eventually scrubbed clean. "Wipe it up," Halvard said. He sounded tired. His wife had just had their second child, and he had not slept properly in 3 weeks. Before the steward sees. "You know what happened last time." She knew. Last time, the steward had taken her charcoal, every piece she had collected over months, hidden in a crack in the kitchen wall, behind the bread bins, and thrown it into the fire in front of her. She had watched it burn with an expression that gave nothing away, because she had spent years perfecting an expression that gave nothing away, and she had started over the next morning, collecting char from the edges of the cooking grates, and the exercise in patience had cost her nothing, because patience was the one resource she had in unlimited supply. She had arrived at Ironmark without a wolf. It was the other thing about her that the garrison found unsettling, though most of them would not have said so out loud. She was shifter-born. The structure of her bones made that clear to anyone with eyes, but she had never shifted, never felt the dual presence that every other wolf-blooded person described as instinctive. She was the lowest rank in a system built on hierarchy, Omega, mute, wolfless, an afterthought in the ledger, listed under household staff as kitchen auxiliary, no designation, but her drawings were always right. The south granary wall had shown a crack in her sketch 3 months ago. The steward had dismissed it. 6 weeks later, the wall had buckled after a heavy rain, and 200 bushels of winter grain had been lost. She had drawn the river gate's iron brace, failing before any of the garrison engineers had noticed the corrosion. But she had mapped the path of a fever through the barracks 4 days before the first man fell sick, tracing it from the south water barrel to the sleeping quarters in a series of arrows that nobody followed until it was too late to do anything but quarantine. Nobody thanked her. Nobody acknowledged it. But acknowledge it would have required acknowledging that she was something other than nothing. And Ironmark had decided, long before she was old enough to have any say in the matter, exactly what she was. She picked up the cloth and cleaned the wall with the automatic efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. The reflection swam briefly in the wash bucket. Dark hair, sharp face, a scar that ran from her left jaw to the corner of her mouth from the winter 2 years ago, when a drunk sentry had thrown a tin cup at her head for walking too loudly through the corridor at night. But she had learned to walk without sound after that. She had already known how to disappear. The garrison was in a strange state of controlled panic the next morning, though they were trying not to show it. She felt it in the accelerated rhythm of boots on stone, in the way the sentries at the south gate stood slightly straighter than usual, in the way Cook, a broad-shouldered woman named Hessa, who ran the kitchen with the kind of absolute authority that comes from being genuinely indispensable, banged the pots with more force than the situation required. "The High Warden is coming," Hessa told her, not gently, jerking her awake by the wrist at first light. "The territorial inspection. Every garrison in the western reaches, and we are fourth on the list, so we have 4 days to make this place look like it deserves to exist. Get up!" Ash got up. She had been awake already, was almost always awake before anyone thought to wake her. The High Warden. She had heard the name before in fragments, the way she heard most things. In the spaces between conversations that people held around her as though she were a table or a doorframe. Rowan Ashvale had held the position for 8 years. Before that, he had been the youngest garrison commander in the north. His wolf was said to be enormous, grey as slate, with a scar across its left flank from a border conflict that had cost 3 packs their eastern territories. He was 31. He was, by all accounts, deeply serious. She thought about him while she peeled potatoes, her hands moving automatically through the familiar rhythm of the work, but she did not know why she thought about him specifically. She thought about a lot of things while she worked, filling the silence that her voice could not fill with the internal landscape that was the only uncontested territory she owned. She had dreamed about him. That was the thing she did not know how to explain, even to herself. But not dreams of the kind that the younger kitchen girls whispered about in the evenings, romantic things, soft-edged and pleasant. These dreams were different. In these dreams she was standing in a stone room, and there was a man whose face she couldn't quite see, and he was looking at her drawings on the wall, and his expression was not disgust or impatience or the studied blankness that she was used to. His expression was recognition, like someone reading a language they had taught themselves, alone, in secret, over many years. Had woken from those dreams with the pulling sensation in her chest she could never explain, a tug at something behind her sternum, like a hook with a very long line attached to it, disappearing into a distance she couldn't see. She did not know what it meant. She had never read about it. The pack did not educate its Omega auxiliaries. She found out what it meant at mid-morning. 3 days later, the kitchen had been cleared for final preparations. Every available person pressed into service in the parade yard. Hessa had told her directly to stay out of sight. They don't want auxiliaries visible for the inspection. Understand? Stay here. She had given Ash a long look that contained several things that were not quite sympathy and not quite apology, and were probably the closest Hessa came to either. Ash had nodded. She had waited until Hessa's footsteps faded, and she had pulled the charcoal from its hiding place, a new cache, built patiently over 6 weeks since the old one was destroyed, and she had gone looking for a wall. She chose the corridor beside the Eastern Records room, where the stone was pale and smooth, the kind of surface that took charcoal cleanly. She worked quickly. She had always worked quickly. Speed was the advantage she had over her fear, but she drew the root of the falsified supply records. 11 months of inflated grain tallies that had been redirected to fund the garrison commander's private debt to a weapons dealer in the eastern provinces. She drew the faulty east well shaft, the one the garrison engineers had declared sound in a report she had watched the commander sign without reading. She mapped the missing patrol rotation that left the northern pass unguarded every 3rd night, a gap that border scouts had certainly already found and were very certainly already using. She stepped back and looked at what she had made. There was more she could say. There was always more. The silence was its own kind of weight, and her drawings were the only way she had ever found to set part of it down. She moved to the next wall and kept going, and then, because she could not help herself, because 20 years of being told she was nothing had left a splinter in the center of her that she had never been able to dislodge. She drew one more thing. Not a warning, something else. In the corner where the wall met the floor, in strokes so small they were barely larger than handwriting, she drew a single image. A wolf, white, sitting, looking up at something that wasn't in the frame. She heard the horn call from the yard. A single long note, then too short. The High Warden had arrived. She ran. She made it back to the kitchen and pressed herself into the corner behind the salted meat cupboard, her charcoal black hands wrapped in a cloth, her heart doing something complicated against her ribs. Through the narrow kitchen window, barely the width of her palm, she could see the parade yard. It came through the main gate on horseback, which she had not expected, and then dismounted before anyone could organize a formal welcome, which she had also not expected. He was tall, built with the particular density of someone who trained because his life depended on it and had made peace with that fact. He wore grey, not armor, travel wear, the kind that had seen actual use. His hair was darker than she had imagined, cut close at the sides, and there was something about the set of his jaw that communicated, from 30 meters away, a comprehensive lack of patience for things that wasted his time. His eyes moved across the assembled garrison with the systematic calm of someone doing a threat assessment, so instinctive it no longer required conscious thought. They were grey, she thought, or something close to grey, and they were moving too quickly for her to be sure. He looked tired. Not the surface tired of poor sleep, but the deep kind, the kind that comes from doing a thing that matters for too long without enough of the other things that make a person remember why it matters. But she did not expect that. She did not expect that she would feel it, either, the moment he rode through the gate. Like something in her chest had been a compass needle spinning in a broken housing for 20 years, and had suddenly, without warning, found north. She grabbed the edge of the window frame. She breathed. The scent came to her even through stone and distance, and the cold autumn air, wood smoke and iron and rain on granite, and something underneath that she had no name for, something that felt like the pressure before a storm, like the air in the moment before lightning decides where to go. Her wolf. The thought arrived with the particular authority of something true. She did not have a wolf. She had never had a wolf. It was wolfless. That was the entirety of that story. That was what she had been told, and what she had believed because she had no evidence for anything else. But something in her chest was pulling toward the man in the yard with the quiet, irresistible patience of a tide. He stopped walking. She saw it happen. It was mid-stride, and he stopped, and his head turned, not toward the garrison commander who was advancing with a welcoming speech, visibly dying in his throat, but toward the assembled wolves who had straightened to attention with varying degrees of conviction. His head turned toward the kitchen, toward the window, toward her. His nostrils flared. Even from this distance, she saw the change in his eyes. He said something to the soldier beside him. One word. The soldier followed his gaze and saw a stone wall with a small window and nothing else. The garrison commander reached him, hand extended. The High Warden looked at him the way you look at a person when you are trying to remember if you have met before, and are increasingly certain you have not. In a moment, he said. The words were not impolite, simply final, the way a door closing is not impolite. He walked directly toward the kitchen. Ash moved backward. The heel of her foot caught the edge of the stone gutter, and she went down hard on one knee, caught herself on the wall, pressed into the corner as small as she could make herself, which was very small. She had been practicing small her entire life. The kitchen door opened, not kicked, not slammed, opened with the careful control of someone who understood that the person on the other side might be afraid. She heard his boots on the kitchen stone, slow, even steps, steps of a man following something he couldn't see by its absence. He stopped on the other side of the cupboard. The pulling in her chest was enormous now. a physical thing, like a hand pressed flat against her sternum from the inside. "You're there," he said, not a question. His voice was lower than it had sounded from the yard, quieter. There was something underneath the control in it, something that she would not have been able to identify if she had not spent 20 years becoming fluent in the things people did not say. "I can feel you." She did not move. "You smell like charcoal and old stone," he said. And something underneath that, something like winter coming in, the first cold air through an open window before the snow. Her hand was over her mouth. Reflex. "Come out, please." She had heard commands her entire life, spoken in exactly the tone that expected immediate compliance. This was not that. This was something she had no word for, a please that was not a performance of politeness but the actual thing, stripped down, honest, slightly unsteady at the edges. She came around the cupboard. He turned and they looked at each other, and the pulling in her chest. 20 years of dormant nothing, snapped into clarity with a force that she felt from the base of her spine to the roots of her hair. He was taller up close. The grey of his eyes was darker than she had thought, more the grey of deep water than of stone, and they were doing something complicated as they moved over her. Not flinching, but the careful pity of someone confronting suffering and deciding how to respond to it appropriately. Something more like the way you look at something you were told did not exist and have just found evidence to the contrary. "How long have you been here?" he asked. She held up both hands, spread her fingers twice, her charcoal-blackened fingers. 20 years. He absorbed that. Something moved through his expression that was not anger, but was in the same neighborhood, something disciplined and cold and pointed inward at whatever he was calculating behind his eyes. "You can't speak," he said. She shook her head. He looked at her hands, at the charcoal, at the cloth she had wrapped around her right palm where she had scraped it on the stone floor, a thin line of blood soaking through the linen. His jaw tightened by a degree she would not have noticed if she had not been watching carefully. "Show me," he said. She led him out of the kitchen, down the corridor, past the great hall where the garrison was milling in confused disarray because their High Warden had walked past them without acknowledgement or explanation. To the eastern corridor, where the pale stone walls still held her morning's work in clean charcoal lines. He stopped. He read. But she watched his face the way she watched everything. From a careful distance, tracking the small things that people thought they were hiding. She watched the muscle in his jaw tighten when he found the falsified supply records. She watched his hands close at his sides when he mapped the patrol gap at the northern pass. And she watched him go very still when he reached the well shaft warning, and then she watched his eyes move down to the corner where the wall met the floor. The small white wolf sat looking up at something beyond the edge of the drawing. He crouched. He stayed crouched for a long time. He did not touch it. "How long have you been drawing on the walls?" he asked. His voice was very quiet. She held up 11 fingers, closed her hands, held up 2 more. 13 months, and they cleaned them. It was not a question. She nodded anyway, every time. He stood up. He turned to face her, and the grey of his eyes had gone dark and fully awake in a way that made the tired look from the yard feel like a different person. "I'm looking at it," he said. "All of it. You have my word." But she felt the heat behind her eyes and fought it with the particular stubbornness of someone who had not cried in a very long time and had complicated feelings about starting. Reached out slowly, giving her time to step back if she wanted to. She did not step back. His thumb found the scar along her jaw, traced it once, light as a question. "Who gave you this?" She mimed a throwing motion. Something hurled, something hitting. She nodded. The muscle in his jaw did it again. The footsteps came fast, multiple sets, the clatter of the garrison commander and at least 2 officers, and then the commander's voice. Garrett, his name was, a man who had run Ironmark for 6 years with the specific mediocrity of someone who understood that the bar was low enough to step over without effort. "High Warden, I apologize. The east corridor is undergoing renovation. It isn't suitable for inspection. Garrett came around the corner and stopped. His eyes went to the High Warden, then to Ash, then to the walls. He went, in the space of 1 second, the color of old ash. Beside him, the garrison's second, a thin man named Council, did something different. His eyes went to the drawings and stayed there, and the calculation that moved across his face was fast and professional and entirely transparent to anyone who had spent 20 years watching people decide what to do about things that threatened them. "High Warden," Council said, his voice smooth and immediate. "The auxiliary. She has been defacing the garrison walls for over a year. We have tried to address it. She is deeply disturbed. She constructs these elaborate. The east well shaft," the High Warden said. He had not raised his voice. He did not need to. "Your engineers declared it structurally sound 4 months ago. Is it?" Silence. "The Northern Pass Patrol gap. Is it real?" More silence. "The supply redirection. 11 months of falsified grain tallies." He paused. "I would like to see the records room now." Garrett looked at Council. Council looked at the floor. "Both of those," the High Warden said, "are your available options. Choose one." They chose the records room. It took less than an hour. The evidence was thorough. Ash had watched where things were filed, and she had drawn that too, in a smaller sketch in the lower margin of the supply records wall, a map of which cabinet held what? The High Warden's adjutant. A compact woman named Isolde, with silver-streaked hair and the air of someone who had not been surprised in 15 years, found the ledgers in exactly the right place and began making notes on a small tablet without being asked. Ash stood in the corridor and watched through the open door. Every few minutes, the High Warden looked up from the documents. Each time, his eyes found her, and each time, something in his face changed by an amount that most people would not have been able to measure. She measured it. He was making sure she was still there. When he was finished, he set down the last ledger and addressed the garrison commander in a tone that was completely, terrifyingly calm. "Garrett, you are relieved of command effective immediately. You will be held at Ironmark pending tribunal." He looked at Council. "Same applies to you." Garrett made a sound. Council said nothing. His face had settled into a flatness that might have been professional composure, except that Ash had seen it before. It was the face of a man who had been waiting for a particular kind of mourning for a long time. "The auxiliary," the High Warden said. She straightened. "She comes with me." Garrett's head came up. "She is bonded to Ironmark as household staff. She was placed here as a child. She is my mate." The words went into the records room and stayed there. The adjutant looked up. The officers at the door looked at each other. Garrett's mouth opened and did not close. "She comes with me," the High Warden said. "That is not a discussion." Ash pressed her back against the doorframe. The pulling in her chest had gone from an ache to something else entirely, something warm and enormous that she had no architecture to contain. Crossed the room and stood in front of her, and she had to tilt her head back to look at him, and the grey of his eyes was close and very real. "Can you walk?" She nodded. "Isolde will take you to the convoy. You'll eat, you'll rest." He paused. "No one will touch you." She looked at him for a long moment. The silence between them was the first silence in her life that did not feel like something pressed against her from the outside. She raised her hand and put it flat against his chest over his heart. She could feel it through the wool of his travel coat, faster than his expression suggested. His heart was going as fast as hers. He covered her hand with his. "I know," he said. "I know." Isolde was quiet and capable and smelled like cedar resin and the particular herb soap that serious people used, and she brought Ash to the convoy wagon and put a bowl of venison broth in her hands with the decisive efficiency of someone solving a problem rather than performing a kindness, which Ash found easier to accept than the other kind. "He's been looking," Isolde said eventually, not looking up from the report she was annotating on her tablet. 2 years. Every garrison in the western and northern reaches. His wolf started. She paused, chose her word carefully, insisting. About 2 years ago, in the middle of everything else, inconveniently. Ash cradled the bowl. The broth was better than anything she had eaten in recent memory, not because it was exceptional, but because she was so hungry that every mouthful felt like a decision being reversed. They tried to ignore it, Isolde said, with the tone of someone describing a spectacularly poor strategy. That did not work, so he started doing the inspections himself. She turned a page. 47 garrisons. She glanced up. He found you on the 48th. Ash slept. He did not intend to. She had not trusted sleep in a long time, had not felt safe enough to fall fully into it. But the warmth and the food and the 20 years of exhaustion that she had been carrying without being able to put it down hit her all at once, and she was gone between one breath and the next. When she woke, the light in the wagon was late and amber, and the High Warden was sitting across from her, reading, his boots still on. He looked up. 4 hours, he said. Stopped for the night. You needed it. She sat up slowly. The wagon smelled like him, wood smoke and rainstone. The pulling in her chest had settled into something that was not the frantic tug of before, but a steady warmth, a hum. He set the book down. The drawings, he said, on the walls. He had Isolde photograph them before the cleaning teams were sent in. He watched her face, all of them. 13 months. She found 86 images. Ash had not counted. 86. It sounded like too many and not nearly enough. Everyone was accurate. Every structural warning, every patrol failure, every contamination path. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. But that's not what I need to tell you. She waited. You have a distinctive way of drawing corners. The way you close a corner, the line overlaps by exactly 1 stroke. Every drawing, every corner, the same technique. It's specific to you. No one else draws corners that way. She did not know where he was going. I found your mark in every image. Not as a signature. Inside the content itself, every 5th line in each image ends at the same coordinate relative to the start point. If you trace those endpoints in sequence, each drawing produces the same shape. He held up a piece of paper. On it, Isolde had connected the endpoints. The shape they made was clear and unmistakable. The same small wolf she had drawn in the corner, sitting, looking up. You signed every drawing without knowing it, he said. Did you know you were doing it? She stared at him. Her hands were shaking. She shook her head. It is not something a wolfless Omega does unconsciously, he said. It is not something a human brain does by accident, with that degree of consistency. That is a wolf. Your wolf, drawing herself into existence because she had no other way out. The warmth in her chest intensified. She pressed her hand against it. But someone suppressed your wolf, he said, and your voice. Both at the same time, a long time ago. Someone did this to you deliberately, and I am going to find out who. She felt 2 tears slide down her face, one on either side, and she did not wipe them away. He did not reach for her. He understood, with an instinct she had not expected from someone who operated the way he did in the public world. Flat, certain, comprehensive, that what she needed right now was not to be touched but to be witnessed. To have someone stay in the room while she cried. He stayed. They traveled 4 days. She rode in the wagon and slept on a real mattress, wool-stuffed, smelling of something dried and herbal, and ate 3 meals a day from plates with matched utensils, and the first time Isolde laid a fork and knife beside her bowl, Ash stared at them for 10 seconds before picking them up, and her hands shook a little, not from weakness, but from the sheer disorienting experience of being treated as someone who warranted utensils. He came every evening, would arrive at the wagon door at dusk, smelling of horse and cold air and autumn, and he would sit across from her and talk, not about the garrison or the evidence or the investigation. Other things. He told her about his mother, who had died when he was 12 and who had maintained, in the small garden behind their house, a corner of plants that only bloomed in autumn because she said the best things happened when everyone else had stopped paying attention. He told her about his wolf, Massive, grey, difficult, prone to breaking furniture when something important was happening, and about the 3 years before Rowan had learned to coexist with him instead of trying to control him. He told her about the 2 years of searching, the 47 garrisons, the specific particular hell of knowing something was real and not being able to find it. She listened, and sometimes she answered. Isolde had given her a small notebook and a stick of proper graphite on the first morning, and Ash had looked at it the way she imagined people looked at gifts they had wanted for a long time without knowing they were allowed to want them. She wrote her responses and held them up. Your wolf broke furniture? What kind of furniture? A conference table. Solid oak. It had been in the garrison hall for 60 years. He looked regretful. Lord Pemberton cried. Tell Lord Pemberton I'm sorry on your behalf. I will absolutely not. He schedules 3-hour meetings about things that could be 1 sentence. The table was overdue. The muscles of her face were doing something unfamiliar. Something involving the corners of her mouth that she had not asked for, but found she did not want to stop. On the second night, he asked about the dreams. You knew I was coming, he said. Not a question. Before I arrived, she hesitated, and she opened the notebook and wrote for a long time. I dreamed of a man in a stone room reading drawings on a wall. I could never see his face, but his hands weren't shaking. Everyone who has ever looked at my drawings and then looked at me, their hands have done something. Disgust or nervousness or contempt. In the dream, his hands were still, and he was saying a name. Not the name they use for me, a different one. One I don't know. He read it twice. He sat very still. But you don't know your given name, he said. She shook her head. You came to Ironmark from a papak that was dissolved. Do you know which one? No one told me. His jaw did the thing she had learned to read. When we reach the capital, I will find out. The capital was large and complicated and smelled like 10,000 people living in close proximity to each other, which was more people than Ash had ever been near in her life. High Warden's residence was not what she had imagined. Not a fortress exactly, more a large, severe house in pale stone, with windows that let in more light than she was accustomed to, and floors that were warm underfoot through some system she did not yet understand. A healer was waiting. Her name was Marin, older, small, with a manner that was neither warm nor cold, but entirely precise. The manner of someone whose competence was so established it had rendered performance unnecessary. Mute auxiliary, Marin said. She looked at Ash the way a craftsperson looks at a piece of work they have been asked to assess, interested, professional, without judgment. Let me see your throat. The High Warden's hand was on Ash's shoulder. Tonight she eats and sleeps. Tomorrow, if she agrees, you examine her. Marin looked at him, then at Ash. Then she nodded once and left. That night, Ash slept in a room with a bed that had a wooden frame and sheets that smelled of dried lavender and a window that looked out over a city full of lights. But she lay awake for a long time, not because she was uncomfortable. She was more comfortable than she had ever been, but because she was afraid that comfort was something that could be taken away, and she had not yet developed the habit of trusting it. In the morning, Marin examined her for 2 hours. Was thorough and serious and explained each step before performing it, which was the first time any healer had done that. The High Warden stood in the corner the whole time. He did not speak, but he was there, and the warmth of the bond between them, something she was still learning the edges of, still surprised by every time she felt it, made the examination something she could endure rather than merely survive. When Marin finished, she sat back on her low stool and looked at Ash. The vocal cords are intact, she said, speaking to the High Warden but not looking away from Ash. Fully functional. No physical damage, no malformation. Then why? Because someone placed a suppression working on her. Ren's voice was flat with a carefully managed anger. When she was young, 4, possibly 5 years old. Old craft, the kind that requires intent and specificity and someone with genuine skill. She paused, as they didn't only take her voice. Working suppressed her wolf simultaneously. One working, two functions. Her wolf has been bound inside her since she was a child. The room was very quiet. Can it be removed? Yes, Marin said, with time. Working is old and deeply integrated. It has grown with her. Removing it incorrectly would cause damage, but it can be done. Ash picked up the notebook. Her hands were shaking badly enough that the letters came out larger than she intended. Who does this to a child? Marin read it. She passed it to the High Warden. He read it, and for a moment his composure did something she had not seen before. It didn't break, it simply went transparent, and what was underneath it was not anger exactly, but something older and heavier that looked like grief on behalf of someone else. That, he said, is what we are going to find out. The investigation took 6 days. The High Warden assigned Isolde and 2 archivists to trace Ash's origins through transfer records, Border Patrol documentation, and the administrative records of dissolved packs. They found her on the 4th day. The pack was called Fernhallow, say, small, eastern, unremarkable in the records except for one detail buried in a census entry so old that the ink had faded to the color of strong tea. Fernhallow's alpha had been a woman named Isabel, but she had been one of the very few female alphas in the region's recorded history. Her wolf had been white, true white, the kind that appeared perhaps once in a generation and was, in the old accounts, associated with the ability to perceive things others could not. She had had a daughter. The daughter had been 4 years old when Fernhallow was dissolved. The daughter's name was not Ash. Her name was Lirith, but Ash, Lirith, was sitting in the small courtyard garden behind the residence when Isolde brought her the information. There was a stone bench there, and an oak tree that had turned the color of old copper, and she had been drawing in her notebook. Not a warning, not a map, just the tree, just the pleasure of drawing something for no reason, except that it was there and she could. The High Warden came out and sat beside her, close enough that his shoulder touched hers, and the contact sent a cascade of warmth through the bond that made her close her eyes, briefly, involuntarily. "We found your name," he said. She opened her eyes. "Lirith, your mother was Alpha Isabel of Fernhallow. She had a white wolf, a seer's lineage, Lirith." She moved the name around in her mind the way you move an object in your hands when you are trying to understand its weight. Strange and right simultaneously, like remembering something you had known before you had words for it. Fernhallow wasn't dissolved because the Alpha died without an heir, he continued. It is what the official documentation says. Fernhallow was dissolved because your mother was killed, and you were taken. She stared at him. "Binding on your voice and your wolf. Marin believes it was placed by whoever arranged your mother's death. A rival pack, but someone who wanted Fernhallow's territory and feared what a seer's bloodline might do with that information." He paused. "They couldn't kill a 4-year-old. There are limits even in the worst of pack politics. They silenced you instead. They bound your wolf and your voice and handed you to the nearest garrison as an unclaimed Omega, and they relied on time and circumstances to finish what they had started." She was shaking, but the small tremors of shock, but something deeper, tectonic, the kind of shaking that happens when the ground you have built everything on shifts. "We don't yet know who," he said. "Isolde is still tracing it. But we know your name, we know your lineage, and we know that your wolf, when she surfaces, will be white." She opened the notebook. Her handwriting was barely legible. "Lirith, I have been drawing the same wolf for 13 months and did not know she was mine," but she stared at what she had written. The wolf in the corner, sitting, looking up. She looked up at him. He was already looking at her. Marin began the work of unraveling the suppression the next morning. Daily sessions, an hour each, in a room that smelled of dried herbs and clean wax. Marin worked with her hands and something older than her hands, a focused intention that Lirith could feel at the edges of her awareness. Pressure, not unpleasant, a sensation of something being slowly, carefully unknotted. After the 3rd session, she felt it. Not a presence she could communicate with, not yet. Something more like a shadow on the other side of a wall, a shape she could sense through the barrier between them. A warmth that was not the bond, something that was hers, specifically and entirely, that had been waiting in the dark for a very long time. On the 5th session's evening, she dreamed again. In the dream, she was in the stone room, and the man was there, and this time she could see his face. It was the High Warden, Rowan. His hands were not moving across the drawings. He was looking directly at her, and she was speaking. In the dream, she was speaking, and the sound of her own voice was the strangest thing she had ever heard, rough and thin and entirely hers. She woke with a sound already forming in her throat. No, not a sound, the shape of one, the attempt, her body trying to do something it hadn't done in 20 years. He was in the corridor, but she could feel him through the bond, the taut warmth of proximity. She opened the door. He was leaning against the opposite wall, fully dressed, his arms crossed. He had not been sleeping. "You dreamed," he said. She nodded. "I felt it." He ran one hand through his hair. "My wolf, when you dream, he responds. He's been responding since the 3rd day. It's becoming difficult to manage in council meetings." She looked at him, the High Warden of the Western Reaches, serious and tired and leaning against a wall in a corridor at some unreasonable hour of the night, looking slightly ruined by a wolf who had opinions about her dreams. She stepped forward and took his hand and pulled him into the room. He went still. She pointed to the bed, then held up both hands, palms out. "Just sleep, only that." He looked at her for a long moment. When he came inside, he lay down on top of the covers, boots on, coat on, arranged with the care of a man maintaining a meaningful distinction. She lay down beside him, under the covers. The warmth from the bond, from his proximity, from the weight of him real and present in the room. It did something to the pulling in her chest that nothing else had managed. The tug settled. The ache became a hum. A frequency she could rest in. She slept. In the morning she woke to his arm around her, his face in her hair, his breathing slow. She lay still and listened to him sleep and felt the wolf inside her pressing gently against the edges of the binding, patient, almost free, learning the shape of what was coming. The binding broke on a Thursday in the garden. It was at the bench, drawing the oak tree's root system, where it had lifted one of the flagstones. The way the root curved was interesting, purposeful looking. The kind of problem the tree had solved over decades without hurry. It was mid-sketch when she felt it. Not a sound, not a sensation, an absence sudden and total. Like a pressure she had carried so long she had forgotten it was there, and then it was gone. And then it was not absence, it was fullness. A wolf came forward with 20 years of force behind her, and Lirith dropped the notebook and opened her mouth, and the sound that came out was not the scream she had been trying to make for 2 decades. It was a howl. It went up through the autumn air and hit the stone walls of the residence, and kept going, expanding outward, rattling the windows on the 2nd floor, sending a spray of starlings erupting from the oak tree in a burst of black wings against grey sky. Her voice, it was back. The howl changed, deepened, became something that was not human and was not trying to be, and the bones of her hands rearranged against the stone of the bench with a sound like green wood splitting. Pain, significant pain, but underneath it a joy so enormous and so physical that it made the pain irrelevant, a joy like breaking the surface after holding her breath for so long she had forgotten what air tasted like. She shifted. The wolf that came was white, true white, enormous, larger than she should have been, larger than any Omega wolf had a right to be, larger than made sense for her small human form. And her eyes were pale as birch bark, and they were lit from inside with something silver that cast actual shadows on the flagstones. The residence erupted. Guards came running. The household wolves shifted on instinct, fur and muscle and noise, a complex territorial alarm response of a pack, encountering something it could not categorize. Reth's wolf did not attack. She stood on the garden bench and howled again, and the howl was not a warning and not a threat. It was the sound of something saying, "I am here," I have always been here. It went out across the courtyard and the residence and the city below, and every wolf in range stopped what it was doing and listened, because that was not something you heard. And then went back to your afternoon. Owen arrived in 30 seconds, which meant he had been closer than she'd thought. Came as his wolf, grey, massive, scarred, with amber eyes that were bright with something she recognized, because she felt it too. He covered the distance in 4 long bounds and stopped in front of her, and did something she would later be told he had never done in public in 8 years of holding his position. He lowered his head, his muzzle pressed against hers, and the sound from his chest was something between a rumble and a keen, the sound of something that had been searching, finding what it searched for. Her wolf trembled. The silver light in her eyes pulsed. She pressed back against him, her muzzle against the scarred side of his neck. They stood there in the garden for a long time. The household guards stood in a ring. With their hands on weapons they did not draw. "Stand down," said Isolde from somewhere behind the line, in the tone of someone who had also never been surprised and was not planning to start. "All of you, immediately." They stood down. When Lirith finally shifted back, it was slower and less violent, the white fur receding, the bones finding their way home without the first shift's chaos. But she came back human, kneeling on the bench, shaking, and Rowan was beside her with a heavy coat that he wrapped around her before she had fully reformed. She looked up at him. She opened her mouth. "Rowan." Her voice was a ruin, cracked, thin, barely louder than the wind. 20 years of disuse had left it rough as bark and low as a question, but it was hers. It was the first word she had ever chosen to say. His face did something that she would remember for the rest of her life. The seriousness and the control and the deep structural tiredness. All of it fell away at once, like a coat slipping from someone's shoulders, and what was underneath it was not what she expected. Young, somehow. Stunned, but something at the edges of his expression that was trembling. "Say it again," he said. "Rowan?" He kissed her, not the way she might have imagined, not with the weight of authority or the compression of years of searching. Soft, tweepin, tentative, the way you touch something you had convinced yourself did not exist and have only just been proved wrong about. His hands held her face, his thumbs on her cheekbones, and the kiss tasted like salt, and she was fairly certain that at least one of them was crying, and she found she did not particularly care which. Isolde found the truth 5 days later. The pack that had destroyed Fern Hallow was called Greyvale. Their alpha, a man named Osric, had wanted Fern Hallow's eastern grazing territories for almost a decade. When Isabel had refused to cede them, he had arranged her death in a way that could be documented as a border incident. He had not been able to kill the child, because Isabel, in her final moments, had done what seers do. She had seen what was coming, and she had called a curse on anyone who shed her daughter's blood. Osric had believed her. Seers were not people you tested. Instead, he had hired a practitioner to silence the child and bind her wolf, and deliver her to the nearest garrison with papers that said she was no one. And then he had waited. For 20 years, checking periodically through intermediaries, making sure the mute Omega in the kitchen stayed exactly that, making sure she was still nothing. Osric was still alive. He was 62, still Alpha of Greyvale, still on the grazing lands he had stolen from a woman he had killed and a child he had tried to make disappear. Rowan received this information at his desk. Lirith was sitting across from him. Isolde laid out the evidence without inflection. Witness accounts. The practitioner's confession, obtained through a process that Isolde described as straightforward in a tone that suggested it had not been. When Isolde finished, Lirith opened her notebook. Speaking for long periods was still difficult. Her voice tired quickly, broke apart, went unreliable. She was patient about it. She had a practiced relationship with patience. "I want to be there when you confront him," Rowan read it. "You will be." They rode to Greyvale with an escort of 200. Lirith rode beside Rowan, not in the wagon. She wore boots, actual fitted boots, and clothing that belonged to her. Her hair was clean and loose, a scar along her jaw was visible, and she had decided to leave it that way, because it was part of her face, and her face had been through considerable things to get here. Osric met them at the gate because he had not been given a choice. He was tall, grey-haired, composed with the practiced composure of a man who had spent decades cultivating the appearance of someone who had nothing to hide and had become so accustomed to it that it no longer required effort. His eyes were sharp and cold, and they moved to Lirith with the specific arrested quality of someone encountering evidence of their own worst decision. "Alpha Isabel of Fernhallow," Rowan said without preamble. 22 years ago, you arranged her death and seized her territory. You bound her daughter's wolf and voice and placed her in Ironmark garrison with falsified papers. The child has been living as a mute, wolfless omega in a garrison kitchen for 2 decades. Osric's face did not change. "Those are allegations. They are facts. We have the practitioner's testimony, the original transfer documents, and the bindings working traced to its source. Have no angle that hasn't been closed." Something moved through Osric's composure then, not remorse, but its exhausted cousin, the specific weariness of a man confronting the accumulated weight of 20 years of a particular choice. He looked at Lirith. "She has her mother's eyes," he said, quietly. To himself, almost. Isabel had those exact eyes. It was not an apology. It was not a justification. It was a man looking at the most honest thing he had said in 20 years. "He'll be held for tribunal," Rowan said. "Greyvale's territory will be returned to its rightful heir." Osric looked at Lirith one more time. "I could have killed her," he said. "I did not. You silenced her for 20 years. Rowan said, "You let her starve. You let her be hurt and diminished and invisible. You did not let her live. You let her endure. They are not the same thing." Osric had no answer for that. The guards stepped forward as Lirith watched him go. She waited for the feeling she had expected. Triumph, vindication, the clean satisfaction of a wrong being named and corrected. What she felt instead was the absence of something very heavy. The story of what had been done to her had been the whole architecture of her life for as long as she could remember, and now it was over, not healed, over. The walls it had built were still there, but she had outgrown what was inside them, and the thing that had lived in the center of that story was gone. She turned to Rowan. She opened her mouth, and her voice came out rough and quiet but entirely present. "I want to see where she lived," she said. "My mother, where her house was." His expression did the thing it did, the thing she was learning to recognize, the thing that happened when he was moved and did not know what to do with it. "Then we'll go there," he said. Fernhallow was half wild, reclaimed by 2 decades of neglect, but Alpha's house was a collapsed outline of stone walls thick with moss, the roof long gone, the interior full of young birch trees that had taken advantage of the vacancy. But behind it, protected somehow by the density of the woods around it, her mother's garden had survived. Not survived, persisted, grown wild and tangled and completely outside its original boundaries, but alive. Autumn blooming plants her mother had tended, plants that opened in the cold and the dark, when everything else was closing, spilling pale petals and strong scent into the night air. They had spread through the ruins and up the broken walls and across the ground in all directions, and in the moonlight they were silver and white and faintly luminous, and their scent was something Lirith had never smelled before, but recognized at some level below thought. The way you recognize a voice you heard before you had words. But she stood in her mother's garden in her bare feet, because she had taken her boots off without thinking, and the ground was cold and she did not care, and her wolf was awake inside her, pressing gently outward with warmth, and Rowan was behind her. "Lirith," he said, "I want to mark you. I want the bond to be complete and for every wolf in this territory to know that you are mine and I am yours. But I need you to say it. Out loud. Your voice, yes or no." She thought about the kitchen at Ironmark, the cold floors, the charcoal hidden in the wall. The maps and warnings that were scrubbed away and then drawn again, and scrubbed away, and drawn again for 13 months. The 86 drawings with the same small wolf hidden in each one, her wolf trying to exist in the only way available to her. She thought about a man who had felt something missing for 2 years and had visited 47 garrisons looking for it without knowing what it was. She thought about her mother, who had tended a garden that bloomed in the dark. "Yes," she said. Her voice was rough and low and still learning how to be a voice, but it was the first thing she had ever chosen to say with it, and it was the right first thing. He stepped forward, his hand curved around the back of her neck, warm and deliberate, and the bite was precise and real, and the pain of it lasted exactly 1 second before the bond completed, not the tentative warmth she had been carrying since Iron Mark, but the full weight of it. Enormous, a flood of rightness and connection so complete that her knees buckled and she laughed, out loud, the first laugh she had made in 20 years, a sound that startled both of them and then continued, low and unsteady and real, because she did not know how to laugh yet, but her body was trying very hard to learn. She marked him in return, her teeth finding the side of his neck, less precise than his but no less certain. And he made a sound she had not heard from him before, involuntary and very quiet, and she filed it carefully in the archive of things she was building about him, the real things, the things underneath the High Warden. They shifted, black and white in the moonlit ruins of Fernhallow, and the white wolf was enormous in the silver light, and she raised her head and howled, and it was not a warning and not an announcement. It was the sound of something that had been silent for 20 years, choosing to be heard, and it went out across her mother's wild garden, and the broken walls and the dark autumn sky, and the long miles of territory that had been stolen and was now, finally, being taken back. The formal presentation happened a week later, in the High Warden's hall. 240 wolves, council members, staff, Lord Pemberton, 76 years old, who looked at Lirith with the expression of a man rapidly revising several of his recent positions. Rowan stood before his wolves with Lirith beside him and said 4 words. "This is your warden." Silence. Then Lord Pemberton, insufferable, hip-sore, chronically overscheduled Lord Pemberton, got slowly to his feet, waving off the attendants who moved to help him. "I knew Isabel of Fernhallow," he said. His voice was old and thin and carried perfectly. "She was the most accurate person I ever met. She told me once, in a room full of people who were not listening, that the best information comes from the people everyone else has decided to ignore." He looked at Lirith steadily. "The daughter has been drawing warnings on garrison walls for over a year, in charcoal, because no one gave her anything better." He turned to the room. "I suggest we start giving her better." He sat back down. Someone in the back laughed, then someone else. And the laughter moved through the hall, and with it something warmer, but something genuine. The specific quality of a large group of people deciding collectively that something was right before anyone had explained to them why. Lirith did not speak to the room. Her voice was getting stronger every day, but sustained speech was still unreliable, and she had spent 20 years learning not to need reliability from uncertain things. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her jacket and took out the charcoal stick she kept there now. Habit, reflex, the extension of herself that had been her voice when she had no other. And she held it up. The room saw it, but she wrapped her fingers around it, pressed her fist to her heart. It was not a formal gesture. It had no tradition behind it. It meant simply, "This was how I survived. This is what I am. I am still here." 240 wolves pressed their fists to their hearts in return. Rowan looked at her. She looked at him. The bond hummed between them, warm and enormous and permanent. Her voice continued to come back, in pieces and then in longer stretches, until one morning she woke and spoke a full sentence without her voice breaking once, and she lay in the dark and said several more sentences just to hear what it was like. And Rowan listened from the pillow beside her, with his eyes closed and his expression entirely open, the expression she had catalogued as the one he only made when he thought no one was paying particular attention. She filled notebooks, but she always would. Not warnings, sometimes warnings, when warnings were needed, because that was a skill she had no intention of wasting, but other things too. The oak tree's root system, a bracket fungus on the north wall that had developed a small ecology of copper-green beetles. The way Isolde's expression shifted by 3 degrees when Lord Pemberton began a speech. The way the bond felt on cold mornings, steady and warm, like a fire in a room that had been cold for a very long time. She planted her mother's garden in the courtyard. The seeds had come from Fernhallow, gathered from the wild tangle of ruins before they left, wrapped in a cloth and tucked into her jacket pocket. The plants came up slow in their new soil, deliberate and unhurried, the way her mother had kept them, the way they had survived without tending for 20 years, waiting for someone who knew what they were. They bloomed in autumn, in the dark, when no one was watching. She watched.